Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Stephanie Roberts, Business Development Manager at WPS. I've also been a school psychologist for 23 years. Today, WPS is honored to have a widely published child psychologist and author of the Developmental Profile, Dr. Gerald Alpern. WPS has had the pleasure of publishing Dr. Alpern's work for over 30 years. Most recently, we have launched the newest revision of Dr. Alpern's widely known assessment, the Developmental Profile 4, or also known as DP4. This assessment quickly identifies developmental strengths and weaknesses in 5 key areas and offers suggested activities for remediation. This rating scale accurately and efficiently assesses developmental delays from birth to 21 years, 11 months. If you already know and use this measure, you may find some insightful tips from the author. If you are considering adding this assessment to your toolkit, perhaps this Q&A with the esteemed author will help you in making your decision. Either way, we're honored to have you join us. And without further ado, let me present to you Dr. Gerald Alpern. Dr. Alpern is a widely published child psychologist who had a private practice in Aspen, Colorado. He has treated families and children for more than 40 years and has performed custody evaluations, supervised family mediation, and served as an expert witness in court. He has done research and clinical work on the use of neurofeedback in treating psychological problems. Before establishing his private practice, Dr. Alpern was a professor and director of research in child psychiatry at Indiana University Medical School. He has published extensively throughout his career, with a special focus on autism, developmental delays, and childhood intelligence. So let's get started. Welcome, Dr. Alpern.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So for today's session, I'd like to ask you some questions that have come from professionals across the country, as well as some questions that have come into WPS about the DP4 and about developmental assessment, if that's okay.
Sure.
Wonderful. So why did you develop the original developmental profile?
Well, when I was that director of research, child psychiatry services at Indiana University, that was back in the mid-60s. I worked at a child guidance clinic, and we were evaluating children every day for various things. And it was very obvious that there was no way of quantitatively evaluating children. There were IQ tests, but there was nothing about the child's physical development or his social development. So it just proved that there was a need for a new instrument. So my first step was to figure out what were the important areas of development for a child. And I did do that. There are 5 areas that are included in the developmental profile: physical, which measures large muscles, small muscles, flexibility, strength, endurance. Cognitive is the second, which is intelligence and academic things. The third area is adaptive, which is measuring a child's competency in life. Like, for instance, if he's an infant or she's an infant, can she find something that's been hidden under a pillow? And later in life, can they fix a bowl of cereal for themselves? So that's adaptive. And then there's communication, the 4th area. That measures receptive language, expressive language, and the child's ability to communicate. And finally, and this was the one that was really missing, was social and emotional area. And that, how do kids get along with peers? How do they get along with adults? How emotionally healthy are they? So I discovered that there were those 5 areas. That was step 1. Step 2, which took years and years, we had to find items that measured all of those 5 areas for kids from birth on up as they developed. And that was very hard. Think about trying to figure out what's the difference between a 7-year-old and an 8-year-old in terms of their communication skills or their cognitive abilities. So for many, many years, we looked for what's called milestones. There always was milestones like at what age does a child start to walk or talk? But finding milestones for social emotional between a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, it took years and years and years, but we did it. And we developed the developmental profile.
Well, I can say I'm very appreciative that you developed this assessment as it's very important when you're evaluating children. Do you have any case examples early on that made an impact on you and piqued your interest in this field?
Well, yeah, there were many, many cases that came into the child guidance clinic. The most typical was a child is now at the chronological age, they should start first grade. However, though they were chronologically the right age, they didn't have the social skills to do it, or they had some handicap. So we had to find some way of determining, is this child ready for first grade? That's just one, but there were many, many examples of things that children were suffering from, but there was no guidance. I'll give you a personal example. This will help. My granddaughter, when she was 5 years old, I gave her the developmental profile, and she came out superior in every area except adaptive, doing stuff for herself, like fixing cereal and things like that. So I saw that and I counseled the parents, and I said, you're doing too much for Jordan. That was her name. And if you stop doing so much for Jordan and let her learn how to do things for herself, dress herself, pick out her clothes, she would be better off. They did that. They stopped over helping her. And within 6 months, when I retested her, she was just fine. There was also, I would say, that when you do the developmental profile, you get a whole set of what to do with the child that is low on any area. It tells you exactly what to do. So there was guidance for the parents to know what to do for Jordan to make her more competent.
And for those who are new to developmental profile or haven't seen the 4 yet, we know that the age range is now extended through 21 years, 11 months. So that's wonderful. How do you think the study of child development has changed over the decades that you've been working on this?
Well, the first and most important one, and the one I'm proud of, is those same 5 areas, physical, cognitive, adaptive, communication, and social, has been adopted by everyone who's doing evaluations of children almost. If you want to enter a child into a special program and they have requirements, they ask for you to give them where the child is in all those 5 areas. That's one change. The second change comes from people having those new developmental milestones so they can distinguish between an 11-year-old and a 12-year-old in any one of the 5 areas. It's really changed the field to know more than just what age does a child usually start to walk. This asks, when is a child able to order food in a restaurant or handle money or be able to physically compete with friends? So those many milestones that we have created over years has changed the field.
And how has your clinical experience affected your work on the developmental profile?
Well, clinical experience, one way to administer the developmental profile is to interview the parents on each item. When you use that method of the developmental profile, you learn a tremendous amount about how the parent and child interacts, about how the child does all kinds of things. You learn, let's say you learn that the child has a defect in some area or is below their age equivalent. What you can do is retest them after you try to remediate for that child. So I've learned that retesting is very important. You find out that a child has some needs in some area, then you usually use the guidance that we provide in the developmental profile, or an expert helps them with their language development or their physical development. And then you retest 6 months later, 3 months later, and you can tell whether what you're doing is helping. And that's very good.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, the retesting, because something that a lot of people may not know about the developmental profile 4 is that when you developed the 4th edition, we added in growth scores. So that's going to help with that progress monitoring. And I know you talked about the parent interview, but for those who don't know the developmental profile 4 very well, we have the parent interview and a parent checklist if you're not able to do the interview, but you also have a teacher checklist, which goes down to age 2, and the clinical rating. So you can use all of those to have that complete picture. So what is the clinical importance of measuring development?
Oh, well, that's hugely important because then you know exactly where the child is on all those 5 areas. You know how to guide the child. And that's not only for children who are below their age skill level, it's also for child who is above their age level. At any age, you're going to find out what the child's strengths and weaknesses are, and then you can remediate, you can retest to see whether that works.
So why is it that the DP4 does not have direct assessment of children in addition to the parent-teacher report?
Because like if you're trying to figure out how a child gets along with peers, whether they're competent socially, you can't pull a peer group out of your test kit. The only way that you can do it is asking somebody who's observed a child in social situations. So most of the items are not directly testable, although there are some that are directly testable and they're very useful. But really, most of the items require somebody who knows the child well enough to be able to answer questions about their communication skills, their physical abilities, or what have you.
Gotcha. So why do you think parent and teachers might have different views of child's development?
Well, teachers and parents see the child in very different environments. And what is required from the child at home is different from what's required in school. So the teachers and the parents see different things. There is also the idea that teachers, have classrooms filled with kids of the same age. So teachers know what a 7-year-old is like and should be competent for, or a 10-year-old or a 4-year-old. Parents usually do not have such comparative groups. So teachers know a lot about a child that the parent won't know. And the parent who sees the child at home knows a lot about the home things.
How do you see yourself and contribution or legacy to the field?
Well, certainly finding which are the 5 most important areas of development and finding out how to measure them easily, user-friendly, that can be retested. The whole contribution of the developmental profile is a major contribution to the field. And as I said, other people have adopted it so that entrance into special education programs or whatever, that's very important. And then I'm kind of proud of those years of work where we found milestones for every age child. And those milestones they had to be picked that they didn't differentiate between males and females or rural versus city kids or high status kids versus low socioeconomic status. I'm very proud of those milestones. And then, and this is very important, I think the idea that we update the developmental profile regularly is very important. We all know that our culture is changing very fast. And so cell phones that weren't available or computer programs that weren't available even the ideas about sexuality have changed and social things have changed. So I think an important contribution has been the need to update any instrument that you're using. And we do that with a developmental profile, and I think it's encouraged other people to do it. I want to say one thing else, and that is that it's not only my contributions as an individual child psychologist, but the publishing company that you work for, Western Psychological Services, has done immense work on the developmental profile, running validity studies, reliability studies, re-standardization studies when we bring the thing up to date. And furthermore, maybe their biggest contribution is that anybody who uses the developmental profile can call them and get fantastic support about any questions they have. And to have that backup that any user can get support is wonderful. And that's done so well by WPS.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'll definitely share those sentiments with our company. And just since you brought it up, I will tell everyone that is watching today's webinar that if they do have questions about the assessment, need further information, they can email the word consult at WPSpublish.com. That is consult at WPSpublish.com. And we'll put you in touch with your assessment consultant who can help you with any questions that you have. Okay, so let me ask this. Has one administration method proven to be more valid than the others?
No, they're all extremely useful. And we have validity studies and reliability studies that proves that. That being said, interviewing the parents gives you additional information because you get a feel for how the child and the parent gets along. You have an idea about how the parent relates to the child and vice versa. So you just get more clinical information, not quantitative information if you do the interview. But again, all of the methods have been proven to be very valid.
Yes, I tell people that I work with the customers that I work with, professionals there, that, interview, it's great if you can get an interview done. You do get a lot of valuable information, but you're not always able to do an interview. So the checklist with the parent is a good method as well. How about growth scores? Can you tell me a little bit about the growth scores and learning more about the growth scores?
Well, growth scores are a complicated thing in that if you, for instance, Googled it, you would find growth scores with all kinds of definitions in all kinds of ways. But what we mean by the developmental profile talking about growth scores is that it's derived from the Roush statistical method. I know that that's not going to speak to most of you unless you're statistical experts. The best way to find out about growth scores is in the manual. There's a section on growth scores, and it will describe it to you. In brief, the growth score measures the child's progress without being compared with other children. So that's the general definition. It tells you how the child is doing as an individual.
So it's kind of like using a yardstick each time. And not comparing them to anyone else.
Right.
Okay. So when all of the scales are not administered, those 5 scales you talked about, when they're not administered, is the report still useful?
Oh, of course, because if you only administered 1 or 2 or 3, for those 1 or 2 or 3, the report that comes back will tell you exactly where the child is. And this might be a good place to just remind people of what the scores are. So on any individual scale, you're going to get standard scores, which of course has a mean of 100, standard deviation of 15 points, stay-nines, usually mostly used by schools, descriptive ratings, which are is the child above or below where they are, age equivalent scores. So you say, okay, on the communication scale, this child is at a 7-year level or a 9-year level. And then you get percentile ranks. Percentile ranks, the schools love those things. Child's at 80% or 30% or whatever. Also, if you give more than one scale, like 2 scales, you have in the manual ways of comparing the child's development and comparing the results on the 2 scales. But any individual scale, you're not only going to get all those scores, you're going to get recommendations about how to help the child in that area.
Great. So this is probably a good time for me to let everyone know that while just like a lot of our assessments, the DP4 is available in paper, but it's also available on the WPS online evaluation system. And so when we talk about reports, we're talking about the reports that are generated on that system. And you're able to, with a couple clicks of a button, you can send out the rating scale if you use the checklist format to the teacher or to the parent for them to fill out. If you do the interview format, you will just pull it up on your screen, or you can print out a PDF that we allow you to do at no extra charge, do the interview with the parent, and then enter in the data. Once you have all the data entered, or the people submit the information for the checklists, then you're able to click score. You're able to check it over. We wanted to make sure our system allows you to check over responses and make sure they make sense before you score. So once you score, you're able to generate those reports, whether it's rater comparison reports, intervention reports, intervention strategy reports, which can be filtered by skill area if you'd like, or the score report. And it's going to give you a description of the performance on that system. And it's going to cost you less to get the online version. And it's going to save you a lot of time and save you money in lost forms as well. So let me go to, let me see. Do you recommend specific, more fine-grained tests for scales that indicate functioning in the delayed level?
Well, what the DP4 does is let you know whether you need to get more detailed information. It's not a screening test. It gives you a lot of information and a lot of guidance on how to help the child, but it also lets you know you need to see an expert in this area. And so for more fine-grained tests, let's say the child is deficient in communication skills, you go to a language person and they can learn from the developmental profile where the child is, and they will recommend, by doing an item analysis, what more fine-grained tests are needed. So either you can follow the directions from the developmental profile, or you can ask an expert in that area, showing them the results, what tests they think are better.
So for example, if the communication, you might consult a speech language pathologist if you're not one, or if it's motor, you might consult an OT, etc. So, but that doesn't mean you have to do more assessment, but it might point you in the direction that you may want to do more assessment. Or they might just look over the information and be able to glean information from what's on the DP4 so that they can move forward with intervening with the child, correct?
Very good.
All right.
I can tell you were a child psychologist for a long time.
So which scale correlates highest with overall functioning?
The overall functioning score is kind of like an average of all the 5 scores. And, the test was developed so that between the 5 areas, there is not an awful lot of overlap. Now, there is some, cognitive and adaptive skills obviously are related to each other. And so you can, I don't think that the overall functioning score is that useful. It's not certainly as useful as the individual scores, but sometimes people want to know, how's this child doing in general? So it's okay. And I can't really say that any one of the scores is more predictive of overall functioning. Traditionally, if you went back 20, 30 years, they would say that language skills is the most one that correlates most with general functioning. That's probably somewhat true.
So I think the takeaway from that for me is that you have to be very careful not to overemphasize the general development score, especially if you have varied performance on the 5 scales, because if you have very low performance in one area and very high performance in another area, it's going to put you, because it's an average, it's going to put you in the middle, but it's not really reflective of what's going on with their development. So that's why it's very important to dig down into those scales.
You're very good. That's right.
All right. So is there a way to check the validity of a test taker's responses?
Well, there are ways. Like the simplest way is, remember I said that there were many items on each scale that can be directly administered to the child. So you can check it by checking the response by you're doing a direct test of the child and seeing whether that correlates with what your caretaker or test taker has done. That's one way. Another way is to give the test to 2 different people, like to a teacher and to a parent, and see if there is a coordination so that they're both saying about the same things. And if they're not, you can question the validity of one or the other. And again, by doing an item analysis, you can do it. For instance, if a child passes an item at the, I'll say it a different way. Let's say a child fails an item at the 5-year level, and the test taker says that he can do a higher item, which requires the skills that they already said the child couldn't do. So if the child couldn't function as a 3-year-old at one level, the chances of them functioning much higher is pretty questionable.
Right. And also just a little bit of caution when the parent and teacher are very different, let's say in their responses. It's very important to get in and do that item analysis so you can see if the environment had something to do with it, the level of support that they get. I know the example you shared earlier about your granddaughter, she was getting a lot of help in those adaptive skill areas from the parents. And so maybe in the school, she was left to do it on her own and wasn't performing, but at home, at home that she was left to do, it was being done for her. So the scores are very low, but at school, maybe she was doing it on her own. So the scores were higher, and the teacher says, no, she can do this at home. So, you have to really dig in and figure out what's going on there. It's very important. Thank you for pointing that out. Are there any final thoughts that you have about the DP4 that you want to share just in general?
Well, with our talk today, it can sound complicated, and I want to underline, this is a very user-friendly test. It's easy to learn to administer by the checklist or the interview. And if you get the reports, they're pretty self-explanatory. So though it may have sounded complicated as we talked about it, use it once or twice and you'll love it, I hope.
Well, I know I love it. That's why I was excited to be able to have this question and answer with you today and share all this information for people who are interested in developmental assessment. And I also want to remind everyone, if there were topics that weren't covered today that you're interested in hearing about, you can send an email to consult@wpspublish.com, and we can give you whatever assistance that you need, whether it's answers to questions or whether you're trying to train a staff or a group of people on using the DP4, online, we can do that. And also the DP4, like I said, is available on the online system. We do trainings for that, but there is also a training video that's about an hour long. It's split up into chapters, and it's called From Start to Finish, the WPS online evaluation system from start to finish. And that is on our YouTube channel. And so I would encourage you, if you do go to YouTube, it's Western Psychological Services in YouTube, not WPS, but Western Psychological Services. You'll find us there. So thank you so much for your time. If you have more questions or would like to learn more about the DP4, again, please email us at consult@wpspublish.com for training, quote requests, and expert assistance. If you enjoyed this webinar and you would like additional training resources, you can visit our WPS webinars page at wpspublished.com/webinars, or visit our YouTube channel by going to YouTube and typing in Western Psychological Services, as I said. And I appreciate all of your time today. Thank you, Dr. Alpern, for your expert advice, and we appreciated you being here today. So thank you.
You're welcome.